Hello and welcome back for an all-new episode of Mystery, Murder, and Magic. I'm your host, Andrea, and as you know, for the past several weeks, we've been talking about the victims of the Moores murders. The first week, we talked about the murder of Pauline Reed, and last week, we talked about the murder of John Kilbride. Well, that brings us to week 3 and the third victim, and today we're going to be talking about Keith Bennett. Now, before we begin, I just want to say a big thank you for all the positive feedback that we've been getting on our episodes lately. It's so appreciated. And so are all the downloads. And when I checked our stats this morning, we were sitting right at 7,700 downloads. And I just know it's going to be like no time before we hit that 10,000 mark. Well, when we do, I think we should do something fun too, like some kind of giveaway or something. Thinking about giving away one of the kids, maybe Alex. Yeah. But now, like, I do have to warn that it's not a big thrill to win him because, like, he's already over 18. You can't claim him on your taxes, so there is that. But we're gonna talk about it more and see which kid we're gonna give away. Just joking, but we'll see what we can come up with. That'll be fun for a 10,000 giveaway. Well, let's go ahead and get started on this week's episode. I'm not really giving away children. I just want y'all to know that. The law won't let me. But anyway, like John Kilbride, Keith Bennett was only 12 years old when he was snatched by Myra Henley and Ian Brady. In the early evening hours of June 16, 1964, Keith left out of his own house for a quick walk over to his grandma's house. Well, not long after he had set out for his grandma's house, a couple stopped him and asked if he'd help them load some boxes into their van. And you see how they just like keep reusing the same stories. Well, he got into the van with the couple, and they promised that once he was finished helping them, that they'd give him a ride back. Well, somewhere along the way, they gave him the story of the lost glove, just like they had given it to Pauline and John. And you know, we all know what happened. Well, just like they did with those two kids, they drove him out to the Saddleworth Moor. Well, again, Myra, she stayed in the car, and Ian led Keith away from where she had parked. 30 minutes later, Ian returned to the vehicle without Keith, but he was carrying a large spade that he had previously hidden there in the moor somewhere. Now, without her even asking him, Ian told Myra that he had raped and strangled the child before burying him somewhere out there in the moors. Well, in the early stages of Keith's investigation, Keith's stepfather, Jimmy Johnson, was the main suspect. And you know how it is, like, anytime there's a murder or whatever, they start with the closest family members. It doesn't seem fair, but I mean, that's just the way it goes. But anyway, it wasn't until other victims started surfacing from these murders, along with some other evidence, that Mr. Johnson was no longer a suspect. Well, for 16 months, Keith's family waited for either their little boy to return home or his body to be found, but it was at that point that authorities assumed that little Keith had been another victim in the Moores murders. Well, even after Brady and Henley were arrested, there was not a bit of evidence at that point that they had murdered Keith. But finally, after he had been sitting in jail for like 2 decades, Ian confessed to murdering him. But he wouldn't tell them where he had left the body. And this prompted Keith's mom, Winnie Johnson was her name, to write a letter to Myra begging her to help locate her son's body. Well, Myra told her that She had only been the lookout when Keith was killed, but she would still try to help. Shortly after Ian passed away in 2017, he wrote a letter to Keith's brother, Alan, told him, quote, "My will contains special instructions for you alone," end quote. Now, however, that was more than likely just an attempt to torture the family, because to this day, Keith's body has never been found. And the family refuses to give up. And I mean, who could give up? The death of a child has to be one of, or if not the worst thing a parent could ever go through. But then to be heinously murdered and then have no remains to lay to rest would just like pour salt in the wound. The family has petitioned the courts, teamed up with the cops. They've searched. They've done everything in their power to bring their little boy's remains home and give them, some closure. And Winnie herself had regularly searched the moors, and even if she didn't locate them, I'm sure she went there as often as she did because maybe she felt spiritually close to him. And maybe that gave her some kind of peace, But now you may recall from the previous episodes in this series that I mentioned that both Myra Henley and Ian Brady had been taken back out to the moors at separate times to try and help locate some of the graves. Well, this is when they located Pauline Reed's grave, but they never were able to find Keith's body. And, I don't know how you would forget. Of course, then again, I'm very bad with directions and stuff, and I probably shouldn't question how you could forget. But when Myra passed away in 2002, photos that she had taken on the moors and some letters and other information were sent to this journalist and document maker named Duncan Staff. Well, he let the police know what he had, and they began using it in hopes of locating Keith. Well, now, as I mentioned, Ian died in 2017, but even while he was on his deathbed, he wouldn't even whisper a clue about where he had left Keith. And there's absolutely no way he couldn't know where he had left his remains. Now, he had been declared insane at one point, but he had full control of his mind, and he had no memory issues. He had to know where Keith was left. Now, I fully believe that him withholding that information from the authorities and Keith's family was like a final act of torture, kind of like in the way a predator plays with its prey. But this time, the predator died and took that secret with him to his grave. Now, Keith's mom, Winnie, she passed away in 2012, and she never found out where her son was left, or where his remains were left. In 2017, a fire burned through Saddleworth Moors, and it gave the family a little bit of hope that maybe, just maybe, finally after all these years, which was at that point 53 to be exact, that maybe, they could finally lay their loved one to rest. And the fire was like one of these fires of epic proportions, and it actually took hundreds of firemen and soldiers to put out the fire that ravaged through the moor. Well, unfortunately, as much of the moors were burned, and to the extent they were burned, Keith's remains still were not found. And they may never be found. Now, in Ian's room at the mental hospital where he lived out the rest of his body, the rest of his life, not the rest of his body. What is wrong with me? Alex sneezed and it just kind of threw me all off. But anyway, in the room in the hospital, the mental hospital, where Ian lived the rest of his life, that's what I was saying. He kept a close watch on these briefcases that he had in the room, and it's believed that maybe they have some information about where Keith's body is buried. And before he died, he gave instructions that upon his death, the briefcases were to be handed over to his solicitor. Well, it's been like 4 years since his death, and those briefcases still haven't been opened. But there's a proposed law that could change all of that. Now, it was around February of this year that this law started being talked about, and I haven't found any updates on it, what's happened since February. But as soon as I find out anything new, I'll definitely give an update. And that actually brings us to the end of today's episode on the Moore, this victim of the Moore's murders. Now, be sure to come back next Monday for an all-new episode, and we'll be talking about Leslie Ann Downey. Now, it's not that these cases so far haven't been heartbreaking, but this little girl's case is very heartbreaking, to say the least. And also, don't forget to come back this Wednesday morning for the Midweek Mini, and on Friday for a new episode of What the Friday. Y'all have a great week.